Hi all, my name is Danielle Wolfe and I am a Social Impact Fellow for the Center for High Impact Philanthropy at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm also a member of Philly Core Leaders here in Philadelphia, which is a great group of young professionals that are passionate about education. And we did this event in October of 2013, one of our Get Schooled series, and I'm sharing it with you now to help give you a background on what's going on with education funding in Pennsylvania. Now, this is an overview of how education funding works, and it provides clarity around what's happening in Pennsylvania. We're not going to go into detail on Philly's school budget crisis, although the way that funding is distributed within the state has certainly had an impact on what's going on here in the city. So with that, we will get started. So I'll begin by talking a little bit about how schools are funded. The largest portion of school funding comes from the local contribution. That's usually a percentage of revenue from district property taxes. And that means that there are large disparities in the revenue that districts are able to raise based on the wealth of their tax base. So here in Philadelphia, for example, we have a low wealth tax base and therefore able to generate less revenue than some of our wealthier neighboring districts. You also have the state contribution, which is a percentage of revenues from income and sales taxes that are usually distributed through a state's general fund. In Pennsylvania, general fund dollars are distributed to districts through what's called the Basic Education Subsidy, which is the large pool of funds that all of the income and sales tax revenue for the most part goes into, and then that gets distributed out to the districts. And then there are other grants, like the Education Assistance Program and School Improvement Grants, that are distributed from the state level, and many of those go to support districts with students with special needs or districts that have schools that need turnaround or improvement. Unfortunately, many of these other grant programs have been defunded during the Corbett administration. Finally, you have the federal contribution, which is actually a very small part of the overall pie that goes to education funding. It's usually only about 5% of the total revenue that a school district spend. And the federal contribution comes from a small percentage of revenue from income taxes across the country, and it's distributed to states in the form of No Child Left Behind funds, or Title I funds, as you may hear, and also grants like the Race to the Top program and I-3. So what's in question here is the role of the state in education finance. So the states actually across the country are in charge of governing public education, and that is understood to include a degree of financial responsibility for how districts are managed. So local governments used to bear the brunt of school finance, but more and more state contributions have become a larger percentage of district revenue over time, especially since as the country goes through recessions, many districts have a shrinking tax base. So the state helps to equalize that revenue. And again, yes, the state contribution is meant to be a supplement to revenue gaps that are happening at the district level. So for example, the state might choose to be sort of an equalizer. So districts with a lower tax base that are able to generate less revenue would get more state contribution than their wealthier peers who are able to generate enough property tax revenue to fully fund their schools. So the state is sort of meant to be that equalizing force. And according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, there is what is considered to be a sound state education finance system. It's supposed to be efficient, it's supposed to provide equity for both students and taxpayers, and it's supposed to provide adequate resources to make sure that students are able to achieve local and state education goals and standards. And most states use a finance formula to ensure that their education finance system is efficient, equitable, and adequate. So what does a school finance formula look like? That's a good question. So to begin with, we have what's called a base spend per pupil. So that's sometimes determined based on the amount a state is willing to contribute to education. So that would be the total funding divided by the number of pupils in that state. Ideally, however, this spend is determined by what's the adequate amount for an average student to be able to achieve proficiency, oftentimes figured out by a costing out study, which actually backtracks and connects a student's ability to achieve proficiency back to the amount of money that it took to spend on that student to achieve those results. And that's the ideal for how to come up with the base spend amount. And then the finance formula would incorporate district need factors. So for example, district size. It's important that any district has enough money to spend on all of its pupils, and that changes annually. It also should include a poverty factor, understanding whether or not the tax base is low wealth or high wealth. And then there's also tax effort. So what's the amount or the rate that a district is having to tax itself in order to generate revenue for schools? And then it incorporates student need factors, so individual students' poverty level, and the number of English language learners or students with special needs within a district. And generally, those district and student need factors are taken into account in what's called weights, which are applied to these factors. So for example, a 1.2 poverty weight would mean that a district would receive an additional 20% of the base spend, the base per pupil spending amount for each low-income student. So districts that have a high number of low-income students or a high number of English language learners would receive more funds to be able to accommodate the students' needs. So why the scrutiny of Pennsylvania's school finance policy? What is different about our state? So Pennsylvania's school finance is not adequate or equitable. There are generally two indicators of the sound education finance system. One is the percent of education revenue contributed by the state. So that's that adequacy factor. Are we spending enough overall on education to make sure that students are achieving? And then there's the fairness of funding distribution to districts based on need. So that's that equity factor. How are we making decisions about how the overall pie is distributed out to districts? Well, in Pennsylvania, the total contribution to education, that adequacy factor, is much lower than other states. The national average of state contribution is 44%, and we're currently at 35.8%. So the overall pie that we are spending on education is smaller than it is in most states. And then on top of that, the way that the pie is then cut up and distributed to districts is done in an inequitable manner. So we have the issue of the fact that the base cost, that base spend that I spoke about earlier, hasn't been set. There was a costing out study that was done in 2007 under former Governor Rendell, but the legislation he put into place to establish that base spend, Act 61, was eventually repealed. And the way we distribute funds in terms of need for the districts is determined by what's called a market value personal income ratio, MVPI. I won't go into too much detail about this. You can find out more on the Pennsylvania Department of Education's website, but I can tell you that it's the way that the basic education subsidy is roughly determines financial need of the districts, but this ratio does not take into account the weighting that we talked about earlier. So oftentimes you have an issue of the MVPI being an average of the income and market value of properties in a particular district, but you might have in one district you might have a lot of families that are significantly on either side of that average, so it doesn't really take into account district needs. It really needs to have weighting involved per pupil. And also, Pennsylvania provides a base amount of funding to all of its districts. So we have every single district across the state receiving 0.15 of its total spend. And so that's regardless of affluence and taxable property wealth. Most districts are receiving at a minimum $500 per pupil. And that's a pretty antiquated and wasteful practice, because it means that districts that actually don't need any state funding to support their schools are still getting funding that could go to lower income districts. And on top of the base funding that all districts get, there's also a cap on the contribution. So districts are only able to get up to 0.8 of their MVPI ratio. So even the poorest districts have to contribute at least 20% to the overall spending in education. And here you can see this chart shows the sort of inequities that exist in Pennsylvania, and this is by poverty rate. So you have the highest quintile of poverty in districts actually spending lower than the lowest quintile of poverty that's all the way on the left-hand side there. Now note that this graph was from 2007 to 2009 spending, so all of these columns would actually be slightly higher than they are here, but the distribution has not changed. So you still have the districts with the lowest amount of poverty spending the most per pupil. And also important to note that this is averages. So while it shows here that on average the lowest quintile, the districts with the highest wealth from property tax are spending about maybe $13.50 per pupil, there are some districts that are spending upwards of $22,000 to $23,000 per pupil, while districts like Philadelphia, which falls into the highest quintile of poverty, are only spending about $13,500, excuse me. Great. So this chart shows you that even within one county here in Pennsylvania, there's an incredible amount of diversity in education spending. So at the top of this chart, you see the school districts like Pottstown and Pottsgrove within Montgomery County. In 2009-2010, they were spending about $14,000 per pupil, but they were taxing themselves at a very, very high property tax rate of 31.1 in Pottstown and 29.3 in Pottsgrove. And then toward the bottom of the chart, we're slowly moving down the poverty scale. And you have a district like Upper Merion, down as the second to last, that was spending $17,000 per pupil and still getting 0.15 of that MVPI ratio from the state, and only having to tax itself at 11 for its millage rate. So incredible disparity in how much districts are having to tax themselves, and the districts that are taxing themselves really high are still not able to generate enough revenue to spend as much as the higher property wealth districts. So major disparity. And basically what this means is that low-income districts are heavily dependent on the state due to their low tax base. So here in Philadelphia, for example, almost half of our revenue comes from the state, either from the education block grant or that basic education subsidy, and then other state revenues, totals 49%. So we really depend on the state to be able to generate revenue for our schools. So how does Pennsylvania measure up to what other states are doing in terms of education finance? Well, unfortunately, we are one of only 3 states that does not have a funding formula in place. And therefore, on most national report cards, Pennsylvania receives a D on a scale of A to F, as we all remember from our school days. This is a pretty abysmal rating, given that most of the states across the country are receiving a C or above. So some may ask, well, what's the role of the court system in reforming school funding policy? Like, why has this inequitable system been in place for so long? And the answer is that even though the Constitution of Pennsylvania says that the General Assembly is supposed to provide for the maintenance and support of a thorough and efficient system of public education, the courts have determined that they are not sort of responsible for determining how the state spends its funds. So in Danson v. Casey, for example, in 1979, the court ruled that uniformity of funding among school districts was not constitutionally required. And Moreo versus Commonwealth, the court ruled that deciding whether or not state funding is adequate is a non-justiciable political question. That basically means that they felt like the court should not have a role in forcing the General Assembly to make equitable finance formula. So what's happening now? Will policy change in Pennsylvania? So there have been new developments that represent windows of opportunity for change. For example, there is a special education funding commission that has formed at the state level to examine how special education funds are distributed to districts and to put a fair formula in place for that specific line of funding. And many feel that that will be an inspiration for funding change to happen across the board for the larger basic education subsidy. There's also some federal policy efforts that are happening. One is the Equity and Excellence Commission, was a congressionally created commission to collect information that will help them analyze what role the federal government might be able to play in state funding issues. And then there was also the All Children Are Equal Act in 2011 that determined they were going to tackle the ways that Title I or No Child Left Behind funds were allocated to school districts to increase efficiency and equity. So the idea behind these two acts is that many feel hopefully that this will trickle down to the state level and influence and push states to really reconsider how they're funding their schools. And also, here in Philadelphia, Mayor Nutter has stood behind the need for an equitable, transparent funding formula and has often advocated for that at the state level, especially in the past year. And fair education funding does appear on the platforms of all four 2014 Democratic gubernatorial candidates. The only differences really in their platforms are how they intend to change the system. Some intend to raise certain taxes versus others to generate more revenue. Some intend to put into place a slightly different formula than others. Definitely worth checking out the differences in their platforms. So how can I get involved? Great question. So the first way to get involved is to stay informed. We have several news sources here in Philadelphia that are great for coverage of both the local funding crisis as well as reform that might happen at the state level leading up to the gubernatorial race in November. And also there are three organizations that I suggest you check out that have advocated for fair funding at the state level. One is the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, which has great resources about the nitty-gritty of how our budget works at the state and how you can find out more about the fair funding. And then Public Citizens for Children and Youth, or PCCY, as well as the Education Law Center of Pennsylvania, have done a significant amount of advocacy and lobbying at the state level for fair funding. You can also vote in the gubernatorial primary on May 20th or the overall gubernatorial election in November. Highly encourage you to get involved regardless of whether or not you want to help advocate for school funding at the state level. Very important to go out and vote. And lastly, if you really want to help get involved in the advocacy process, definitely consider attending one of PCCY's community mixers or City Hall Action Days, which are happening throughout May, June, and July of this year. Listed here are a set of additional resources that you can look into if you want to better understand how school funding works across the country. I highly recommend especially the report on the stealth inequities of school funding, which is the second link there, which gives a very in-depth analysis of how inequity happens at the state funding level across the country. And Pennsylvania is one of the case studies that they look into there, which was the source of much of the information you see in this PowerPoint. So with that, I will bring us to a close. Thank you so much for tuning in to this session, and definitely recommend that you get involved in upcoming Philly Core Leader events as well as YIP events that talk about education policy, and especially finance, because this is going to be a very, very important issue for the next couple of years, both politically and socially. So thank you all for listening.